July 14th, 1944. A dusty field outside Saint-Lô, France. General Omar Bradley stands with his arms crossed, watching a Sherman tank rev its engine in front of a 12-foot-high wall of earth, roots, and centuries-old vegetation. Welded to the tank's nose are crude steel tusks, salvaged from Hitler's Atlantic Wall, shaped by a motor pool welder in the dead of night. Bradley had seen 1,000 proposals for solving the hedgerow problem, engineers with blueprints, ordnance officers with requisition forms, contractors promising specialized equipment that would arrive in 6 months. This was different. This was a sergeant with a welding torch and an idea born from watching men die. The Sherman lurched forward, the metal teeth bit into the hedgerow, and in 43 seconds, the tank punched through a barrier that had stopped the entire Allied advance for 6 weeks. Bradley turned to his aide. "Get me 500 of these. I don't care how. Get them made." What he was watching wasn't just a tank breaking through vegetation. It was the Normandy breakout being born in a motor pool, created by a cavalry reconnaissance sergeant who'd been told his idea was too simple, too crude, and definitely not approved by the War Department. Sergeant Curtis Culin had welded scrap metal to a 30-ton killing machine without authorization, without engineering approval, and without any concern for what would happen if his unauthorized modification failed in front of a 3-star general. The bocage hedgerows of Normandy had turned Operation Overlord into a meat grinder. Every field was a fortress, every lane was a killing ground, and the Shermans that were supposed to spearhead the breakout were getting slaughtered because nobody in England had bothered to tell tankers that French hedgerows weren't just bushes. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Norman countryside as Staff Sergeant Curtis Culin walked the perimeter of his unit's assembly area near Carrington, counting the burned-out Shermans that littered the fields like steel tombstones. 19 days since D-Day, and the great Allied advance had stalled against an enemy nobody had properly briefed them about. Not the Wehrmacht, the hedgerows. The bocage was ancient, some sections dating back to Roman times when farmers had piled earth and stone to mark property boundaries. Over centuries, the mounds had grown into massive earthen walls, 8 to 12 feet high, 3 to 4 feet thick, with root systems that penetrated 6 feet down. Atop these walls grew a tangle of hawthorn, oak, bramble, and vegetation so dense that French farmers used them as natural livestock fencing. Norman fields averaged 200 by 400 yards, each one surrounded by hedgerows that created a landscape of green-walled boxes stretching across the entire Cotentin Peninsula. The tactical problem was brutally simple. To advance, tanks had to climb over hedgerows. The Sherman's design meant its thinnest armour, the belly plate, was only 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch thick, designed to protect against mines, not anti-tank guns. When a Sherman climbed a hedgerow, the tank's nose rose at a 45-degree angle, exposing that vulnerable belly to any German gunner with a clear line of sight. The PaK-40 anti-tank gun, Germany's standard defensive weapon, could penetrate Sherman belly armour at ranges exceeding 800 yards. The tactical mathematics were unforgiving. A Sherman attempting to cross a hedgerow became a stationary target for approximately 8 seconds, the time required to climb the earthen wall, balance on the crest, and descend the opposite side. 8 seconds with its weakest armour facing the enemy. German defensive doctrine in Normandy exploited this vulnerability with methodical precision. Infantry squads equipped with Panzerfausts positioned themselves in hedgerows, providing flanking fields of fire. PaK-40 crews dug into positions covering multiple field boundaries, their camouflage so effective that American reconnaissance rarely spotted the guns until they opened fire. When Shermans attacked, German crews waited. They let the tanks begin their climb, watched the belly armour expose itself, and fired at the moment of maximum vulnerability. The first round typically penetrated the belly plate, detonating ammunition stored in the hull or killing the driver and assistant driver. If the crew survived the initial hit, the tank was immobilized on the hedgerow crest, blocking the advance and providing German gunners with a stationary target for finishing shots. The 2nd Armoured Division's experience during the drive towards Saint-Lô provided stark documentation of the tactical crisis. Between June 7th and June 20th, 1944, the division lost 62 Sherman tanks to enemy action in bocage fighting. Combat reports indicated that 47 of those losses, 76%, occurred during or immediately after hedgerow crossing attempts. Crew survival rates were catastrophic. The belly hits that stopped Shermans typically detonated stored 75mm ammunition, creating internal explosions that gave crews less than 3 seconds to evacuate. Battalion after-action reports listed tank crews as killed in action without the usual breakdown of wounded versus killed, because belly penetrations rarely left wounded survivors. Culin had joined the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron in 1942, trained on tanks at Fort Knox, and crossed the Atlantic believing American armor superiority would manifest in open-field maneuver warfare. The bocage had shattered that assumption within 48 hours of landing at Omaha Beach. His squadron's first encounter with hedgerow terrain occurred on June 9th near Carentan, when 4 Shermans attempted to advance across 3 fields toward a suspected German observation post. The lead tank climbed the first hedgerow, exposed its belly, and took a PaK-40 round that penetrated the hull beneath the turret basket. The explosion killed the driver instantly and wounded the other 4 crew members, 3 of whom died before medics could reach them. The second Sherman, attempting to provide covering fire, climbed an adjacent hedgerow and was hit before its gun could traverse toward the German position. The remaining 2 tanks withdrew, leaving 8 dead or dying tankers in 2 smoking wrecks that burned for 6 hours before recovery crews could approach them. The tactical response from American commanders focused initially on combined arms solutions. Infantry would advance ahead of armor, suppressing German positions with small arms and mortar fire. Artillery would saturate suspected anti-tank gun positions with high-explosive shells. Tactical air support would strike identified German defensive positions. These measures helped, but none solved the fundamental problem. Shermans still had to cross hedgerows, and crossing still meant exposure. Engineers proposed using explosives to blow gaps in hedgerows, creating passages where tanks could advance without climbing. The technique worked in principle, but required 20 to 30 pounds of TNT per gap, consumed time the tactical situation rarely provided, and announced American intentions to every German position within hearing distance. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The 1st Army Engineer Special Brigade tested a bulldozer blade mounted to Sherman chassis, creating an armoured bulldozer that could theoretically push through hedgerows rather than climbing over them. The prototype succeeded in demonstrations on lighter hedgerows, but failed against the ancient, deep-rooted Norman bocage. The blade couldn't develop sufficient force to tear through root systems that had been growing for centuries. More critically, the bulldozer modification required removal of the Sherman's bow machine gun and significant structural changes to the hull front, modifications that couldn't be performed in field conditions and would take months to implement across the armoured divisions in France. Tank crews developed their own field expedients with varying success. Some units attempted to back their Shermans into hedgerows at high speed, using the tank's weight and momentum to create crude passages. This technique occasionally worked on newer, less established hedgerows, but more often resulted in damaged suspension systems, broken track, or bogged vehicles that required recovery under fire. Other crews tried using the Sherman's main gun to blast gaps in hedgerows, firing high-explosive shells at point-blank range into the earthen walls. The 75mm shells created impressive explosions and scattered vegetation, but rarely penetrated deep enough through the earth and root mass to create a passage large enough for a tank. By late June, the tactical stalemate was affecting strategic planning at the highest levels. General Dwight Eisenhower's staff had projected the Allied advance would reach the Via River by June 15th and be positioned to break out toward Brittany by June 25th. Instead, 19 days after D-Day, American forces remained locked in brutal yard-by-yard, fighting across terrain that negated every advantage American armor should have possessed. German defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, were inflicting casualties at rates that threatened to undermine the entire Normandy campaign's timeline. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding 1st Army, visited the 2nd Armoured Division's sector on June 26th to personally assess the tactical situation. His after-action notes from that visit described the hedgerow problem with unusual candour for a senior officer. "We are fighting the worst damn country for armour I have ever seen. Every field is a death trap. Every hedgerow is a fortress. Our tanks are magnificent machines being destroyed by geography we didn't properly recognise or prepare for." Bradley ordered his operations staff to prioritise solutions to the hedgerow problem above all other tactical concerns, noting that without solving mobility issues in the bocage, the planned breakout operation, codenamed Cobra, could not succeed. Curtis Culin wasn't thinking about Operation Cobra. He was thinking about the faces of tank crews he'd eaten breakfast with, men who'd been killed because their Shermans climbed hedgerows and exposed belly armour to German gunners who never missed. Culin had survived 3 hedgerow crossings in his reconnaissance vehicle, a Stuart light tank with even thinner armour than the Shermans, and each crossing had left him waiting for the impact that would end his war in a fraction of a second. The tactical problem obsessed him. There had to be a solution that didn't involve explosives, didn't require months of engineering development, and could be implemented with the tools and materials available in a Norman farm field. The idea came to him on July 4, 1944, while examining destroyed German beach obstacles at Utah Beach. The 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron had been pulled back to the beach area for a 72-hour rest and refit after 2 weeks of continuous combat operations. Culin had walked down to the beach perimeter, looking at the steel hedgehogs, Belgian gates, and angle iron obstacles the Germans had constructed to stop landing craft during the invasion. The obstacles were crude but effective. Angled steel beams welded into X-shaped frames, designed to rip out the bottoms of landing craft or detonate mines. They'd failed to stop the invasion, but they'd accomplished their design purpose. They were sharp, they were strong, and they could penetrate steel. Culin stood there looking at tons of scrap steel that Allied engineers had bulldozed into piles for eventual salvage. The steel was heavy gauge, combat proven to withstand explosive forces, and available in unlimited quantities all along the invasion beaches. And he had an idea that his motor pool sergeant would either love or have him court-martialed for suggesting. What if you took those steel obstacles, cut them into prongs, and welded them to the front of a Sherman, not on top where they'd add weight and raise the tank's centre of gravity, but low on the bow, angled down like tusks or teeth? A tank approaching a hedgerow wouldn't climb over it. The steel prongs would bite into the earthen wall below the vegetation line, at ground level where the hedgerow was thickest and oldest, but also where tanks had the most traction and power. The Sherman would push through the hedgerow rather than over it, keeping its belly armour horizontal and protected, breaking through the root system with brute force amplified by sharp steel cutting edges. The engineering was crude but sound. The Sherman's bow armour was 3.5 inches thick on late-model variants, easily capable of supporting welded steel attachments without structural compromise. The Chrysler multibank engine produced 425 horsepower at 2,800 revolutions per minute, more than sufficient to drive steel prongs through compressed earth and root systems if the attack angle was correct. The key was mounting the prongs low enough to engage the hedgerow's base, where centuries of soil compression had created the densest material, but also the point where breaking through would destabilize the entire earthen wall above. Culin sketched his idea on paper torn from a field message pad, crude drawings that showed a Sherman's frontal profile with 4 angled steel prongs extending forward from the bow. The prongs would be approximately 3 feet long, angled down at 30 degrees from horizontal, with sharpened tips to penetrate soil and roots. He calculated, using nothing more sophisticated than remembered physics from high school, that a 30-ton Sherman moving at 5 miles per hour would generate roughly 12,000 pounds of force at each prong tip. If the hedgerow's resistance exceeded that force, the tank would stall. If the prongs could penetrate and break the root structure, the tank would punch through. He took his sketches to Technical Sergeant Theodore McNally, the squadron's senior motor pool mechanic, and a man who'd kept reconnaissance vehicles running under conditions that would have defeated factory-trained technicians. McNally looked at the drawings for maybe 30 seconds before responding. "It'll either work perfect or rip the front off your tank. Only one way to find out which." They needed steel, welding equipment, and a tank whose crew was willing to risk having unauthorized modifications destroy their vehicle in combat. The steel was easy. McNally dispatched 2 privates with a truck to Utah Beach with orders to bring back German beach obstacles, the heavier the better. They returned 6 hours later with 3 hedgehog obstacles and assorted angle iron sections, approximately 800 pounds of steel that had been designed by German engineers to stop American landing craft and would now be repurposed to break German defensive lines. The welding equipment was standard motor pool issue. Every armoured unit carried portable welding rigs for field repairs to damaged vehicles. The welder assigned to the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron was Private Robert Dossett, a former Pennsylvania shipyard worker who'd been welding since age 15 and could run a bead on steel plate in conditions that would challenge factory workers. Dossett examined Culin's sketches and the scrap steel, then nodded. "I can make this. Won't be pretty, but I can make it strong. When do you want to start?" Finding a tank crew willing to serve as test, subjects proved easier than expected. Lieutenant Robert Calker commanded a Sherman in the squadron's tank platoon and had lost 2 friends to belly hits during hedgerow crossings. When Culin explained the concept, Calker's response was immediate. "If it means I don't have to climb over those damn hedgerows with my belly hanging out, weld whatever you want to my tank. Just make sure it's on there solid because I'm not dying because something fell off." They worked through the night of July 5th into the morning of July 6th in a field maintenance area screened from aerial observation by camouflage netting. McNally and Culin cut the German beach obstacles into sections using a cutting torch, creating 4 prongs, each approximately 3 feet long and 3 inches in diameter at the base, tapering to sharpened points. Dossett positioned the prongs against the Sherman's bow armour, spacing them to match the width between the tank's tracks, angling them downward at what his experienced eye judged to be 30 degrees, though they had no protractor to verify the measurement. The welding took 4 hours. Dossett ran continuous beads along each prong's mounting surface, building up weld material, until each attachment point was nearly half an inch thick. The welds weren't beautiful, but they were structural. Each prong was secured with approximately 12 inches of weld bead that tied the steel directly into the Sherman's bow armour. When Dossett finished the last prong and shut down his welding rig, the Sherman looked like it had grown steel tusks, crude and aggressive modifications that violated every regulation about unauthorized field modifications to combat vehicles. The test happened on the morning of July 6th, in a field 2 miles behind the front lines. Culin had selected a hedgerow that matched the characteristics of those stopping American advances, ancient, approximately 10 feet high, with visible root systems that suggested centuries of growth. Lieutenant Calker climbed into his modified Sherman, while Culin, McNally, Dossett, and approximately 20 other squadron members gathered to watch what would either validate a breakthrough solution or demonstrate why sergeants shouldn't play engineer. Calker started the engine, advanced the throttle, and drove the Sherman directly at the hedgerow at approximately 5 miles per hour. The steel prongs hit the earthen wall with an impact that was audible 50 yards away, a deep thud that sounded like axe blades striking hardwood. The tank didn't slow. The prongs bit into the soil, penetrating through the compressed earth and encountering the root system that gave bocage hedgerows their structural integrity. For perhaps 2 seconds, the Sherman seemed to hesitate, engine note deepening as the tracks fought for traction. Then something in the hedgerow's structure failed. The root system, attacked from below by sharp steel moving with 30 tons of force behind it, began tearing. The Sherman pushed forward, the prongs acting like ploughs, breaking through dirt and roots in a wave of displaced earth that fountained up and around the tank's hull. Vegetation collapsed onto the Sherman's deck as the entire hedgerow's structural integrity failed once the root system was compromised. 14 seconds after impact, Lieutenant Calker's Sherman emerged on the opposite side of the hedgerow. The tank had punched a gap approximately 8 feet wide, plenty of room for following vehicles. The prongs were still attached, slightly bent but structurally intact. Most importantly, the Sherman's belly armour had never angled up beyond 20 degrees. Calker had crossed a bocage hedgerow without exposing his tank's vulnerable underside to German anti-tank guns. Culin felt a surge of vindication that lasted exactly as long as it took him to realise he'd just committed a court-martial offence by modifying a combat vehicle without authorization. The spectators who'd watched the test included 2 lieutenants, a captain, and a major from the division engineer staff who'd heard rumours about unauthorized welding projects. None of them were smiling. Major Herschel Baker, 2nd Armoured Division Assistant Operations Officer, had been sceptical when he'd received reports that a cavalry reconnaissance sergeant was welding scrap metal to tanks. The Army had procedures for equipment modifications, testing protocols, engineering approval chains, and safety certifications that existed specifically to prevent field expedients from killing American soldiers. Unauthorized modifications violated half a dozen regulations and created liability issues that could end careers. But Baker had also read the casualty reports from 3 weeks of hedgerow fighting, and he'd attended memorial services for tankers whose Shermans had been penetrated through their belly armour. When he watched Calker's modified tank punch through a hedgerow in 14 seconds without exposing its vulnerable underbelly, Baker made a decision that would either accelerate his career or destroy it. "Sergeant Culin," Baker said, approaching the group gathered around the modified Sherman, "you're either going to be court-martialed or decorated, and right now I genuinely don't know which. But before anyone makes that decision, General Bradley needs to see this. Can you do it again tomorrow? Same place, same time?" The demonstration for General Omar Bradley took place on July 14, 1944, in the same field where Culin had conducted his initial test. Bradley arrived with his aide, the 1st Army Operations Officer, and 3 officers from the Engineer Special Brigade. The general's reputation among enlisted men was solid. He'd risen through ranks commanding troops rather than staff positions, and soldiers respected that he'd spent time in forward areas during the Normandy fighting, instead of directing operations from rear command posts. But he was still a 3-star general watching an unauthorized modification performed by a sergeant, and the outcome of this demonstration would determine whether Cullin's innovation changed the war or ended his military career. Lieutenant Calker climbed into his Sherman, now painted with the name Rough Rider, and a crudely welded steel hedgerow cutting device that looked like something from a medieval siege engine rather than modern mechanized warfare. Bradley stood with his arms crossed, his expression neutral, while his staff arranged themselves to observe the demonstration from optimal angles. The hedgerow Culin had selected was, if anything, more challenging than the one used in the first test. A massive earthen wall, probably dating back 2 centuries, thick with oak and hawthorn root systems, the kind of obstacle that had stopped American armour for 6 weeks. Calker started the engine and advanced. The Sherman's steel prongs hit the hedgerow, bit deep, and began their brutal work of tearing through centuries-old root systems with the inexorable force of American industrial power directed through crude but effective steel cutting edges. The earth fountained up, vegetation collapsed, and 43 seconds after impact, the Sherman emerged on the opposite side of the hedgerow, tracks still gripping the ground, hull angle never exceeding 20 degrees, belly armour protected throughout the entire crossing. Bradley watched the entire sequence without speaking. When the Sherman completed its pass, he turned to his aide. "Get me Colonel McCarthy from Ordnance. I want 500 of these devices manufactured and distributed to armoured units within 2 weeks. I don't care if we have to shut down every repair depot in France to get welders working on this." He turned to Major Baker. "What's the sergeant's name who came up with this?" Staff Sergeant Curtis Culin, sir, 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. Make sure his name goes in the official report, Bradley said, and somebody find out if there's a regulation I can cite that technically authorized this modification, because I'm not having the man who just solved our biggest tactical problem face charges for thinking like a soldier instead of a bureaucrat. The impact of Bradley's decision rippled through First Army with the speed of a tactical intelligence bulletin. By July 15th, ordnance officers across Normandy received orders to fabricate hedgerow cutting devices using any available steel and every available welder. The design specifications were deliberately vague, essentially describing Culin's concept without mandating exact dimensions or construction techniques. Units were authorized to improvise based on available materials, prioritizing speed of production over standardization. The engineering challenge was actually simpler than most field fabrication projects. German beach obstacles provided essentially unlimited steel in appropriate dimensions. Every invasion beach from Utah to Sword had tons of steel, hedgehogs, angle iron obstacles, and Belgian gates bulldozed into salvage piles. Ordnance units dispatched trucks to collect beach obstacles, creating a bizarre supply chain where German defensive materials designed to stop D-Day were being repurposed to break the post-invasion stalemate. Welders worked around the clock. The 2nd Armoured Division's Ordnance Company fabricated 68 hedgerow cutters in 4 days, using an assembly line process, where teams cut steel, shaped prongs, positioned them on Sherman bows, and welded them in place. Each device required approximately 4 hours of labor from initial cutting to final weld inspection. The work was hot, physically demanding, and conducted under blackout conditions to avoid attracting German bomber attention, but progress was measurable in devices completed per day rather than weeks of engineering development. Different units evolved slightly different designs based on their welders' preferences and available materials. Some devices used 4 prongs, others used 6. Prong lengths varied from 30 inches to 48 inches depending on the steel sections available. Mounting angles ranged from 25 degrees to 35 degrees. This variation would have horrified peacetime engineers obsessed with standardization. But in July 1944 Normandy, the only metric that mattered was whether the device allowed Shermans to penetrate hedgerows without exposing belly armor. Every design tested in the field succeeded at that mission. Tank crews adopted the modifications with enthusiasm that bordered on reverence. Shermans equipped with hedgerow cutters acquired nicknames: rhino tanks, after the animals that used horns to charge through obstacles. The name spread through armored units faster than official nomenclature could establish alternative terminology. Crews painted rhino imagery on their tanks, added kill markings for hedgerows penetrated, and developed tactics that exploited their new capability to move through bocage terrain without the suicidal exposure that had defined the previous 6 weeks of combat. The tactical transformation was immediate and profound. Tank platoons that had previously required 30 minutes to advance across a single hedgerow-bounded field, using covering fire and exposed crossings, could now penetrate 3 or 4 fields in the same time. Rhino tanks advanced directly at hedgerows, punched through them, and emerged into German-held fields, with their guns already oriented toward likely enemy positions. The Germans, who'd built their entire defensive doctrine around the assumption that American tanks would climb over hedgerows and expose belly armor, found themselves facing an enemy that no longer accepted that tactical disadvantage. Intelligence reports from German prisoners captured in late July described the psychological impact of rhino tanks on defensive operations. Wehrmacht officers had told their anti-tank crews to wait for American armor to begin climbing hedgerows before firing, targeting the moment of maximum vulnerability. When Shermans instead crashed through hedgerows at ground level, German gunners found themselves engaging tanks that remained in optimal fighting configuration rather than exposed and struggling. The tactical surprise wasn't technological superiority. It was American forces adapting faster than German defenders could revise their doctrine. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By the third week of July, First Army had distributed approximately 300 hedgerow cutting devices across its armoured units. The remaining 200 devices in Bradley's original 500-unit order were being fabricated as rapidly as welders could work. The production bottleneck wasn't steel or welding capacity, but rather the time required to actually mount and weld devices onto tanks that were simultaneously needed for combat operations. Units developed rotation schedules where tanks cycled through ordnance depots for modification between combat missions, with crews remaining with their vehicles throughout the installation process to ensure they understood the device's capabilities and limitations. Curtis Culin had become unexpectedly famous within First Army. His name appeared in tactical bulletins describing the hedgerow cutter's development. Officers from units receiving the devices wanted to meet the sergeant who'd solved a problem that had stumped engineers and tactical planners. Culin handled the attention with the pragmatic modesty of an enlisted man who'd simply wanted to stop watching his friends die. When asked by a Signal Corps correspondent how he'd developed the idea, his response was characteristic. "I watched tanks get hit climbing over hedgerows, and I figured there had to be a better way through than over. Turned out there was." The broader implications of Culin's innovation extended beyond individual tank tactics. Operation Cobra, Bradley's planned breakout operation, had been postponed twice because First Army lacked the mobility to exploit any breakthrough achieved by concentrated air bombardment and artillery preparation. German defenders could retreat from bombardment areas into adjacent hedgerow-protected positions, confident that American armor would struggle to pursue them through bocage terrain. Rhino tanks changed that calculation fundamentally. A breakthrough could now become a breakout because American armor could finally move through Norman hedgerows at speeds approaching open-field maneuver. Bradley scheduled Operation Cobra to begin on July 24, 1944, with the understanding that his armored divisions could now exploit success in ways that had been impossible 6 weeks earlier. The tactical plan called for massive aerial bombardment to shatter German defensive lines west of Saint-Lô, followed by armoured penetration through the shattered defences and rapid exploitation toward Coutances. The success of that plan depended entirely on armour being able to move through hedgerow terrain without accepting the casualties that had characterised the previous weeks of bocage fighting. Rhino tanks made that movement possible. Weather delayed Cobra's start until July 25th, but when the operation launched, its success validated every assumption Bradley had made about hedgerow cutting devices' tactical impact. The morning of July 25th, 1944, began with the roar of engines that seemed to shake the earth itself. Over 1,500 heavy and medium bombers approached the German defensive line west of Saint-Lô, carrying 3,300 tons of bombs. The aerial bombardment was unlike anything the Wehrmacht had experienced in Normandy. For 90 minutes, American bombers saturated a rectangular target area 5 miles wide and 1.5 miles deep, transforming German defensive positions into moonscapes of overlapping craters. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. German soldiers who survived the bombardment emerged from their positions shaken, disoriented, and convinced they were facing an enemy with unlimited resources. By the eve of Operation Cobra, 60% of First Army tanks had been equipped with the Rhino modification. Bradley had specifically ordered units to preserve operational security by not using the devices until the offensive began. He wanted the Germans to encounter Rhino tanks for the first time during combat operations, denying them any opportunity to develop counter-tactics or modify their defensive positions. The secrecy had held. Wehrmacht intelligence reports from late July made no mention of American tanks equipped with hedgerow cutting capabilities. The ground assault following the aerial bombardment demonstrated immediately why Bradley had prioritized Rhino tank production. Armored columns advanced through hedgerow terrain at speeds that would have been impossible just 3 weeks earlier. Tanks no longer paused at field boundaries, waiting for engineers to blow gaps or for infantry to clear German positions. Instead, Rhino-equipped Shermans crashed through hedgerows, emerged into enemy-held fields with their guns already oriented toward likely defensive positions, and continued advancing before German crews could adjust their anti-tank weapons to engage the unexpected threat. By the morning of July 27th, the full weight of 3 divisions of 7 Corps was being applied, and the German front line disintegrated before the attacking American soldiers. The tactical transformation was visible in after-action reports filed by battalion commanders. Units that had required hours to advance across single fields during June were now penetrating multiple hedgerow-defended positions in the same time frame. The Rhino tanks had fundamentally altered the tactical mathematics of bocage fighting. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, led his Rhino-equipped Shermans in an exploitation mission that exemplified the device's strategic impact. His battalion advanced 12 miles on July 28th, a distance that would have required days or weeks during the June fighting. German defenders attempting to establish new defensive lines found themselves outmaneuvered by American armor that could move through hedgerow terrain at nearly the same speed as open field maneuver. The psychological effect on Wehrmacht units was profound. They had built their entire defensive doctrine on the assumption that bocage terrain would slow American advances to a crawl, buying time for reinforcements and allowing smaller German forces to inflict disproportionate casualties. Rhino tanks invalidated those assumptions. On July 28th, an advance of 12 miles by the 4th Armored Division allowed them to capture Coutances. The capture of this road junction severed German supply lines and forced Wehrmacht units in the western sector to withdraw or face encirclement. American forces captured Avranches on July 30th, and the following day, Patton's Third Army was officially activated. The Normandy breakout had succeeded, transforming what had been a grinding war of attrition into a war of movement that would carry Allied forces across France in less than 2 months. Curtis Culin watched Operation Cobra's success from a maintenance area behind the front lines, where his reconnaissance squadron was preparing for follow-on operations. The scale of the breakout exceeded even Bradley's optimistic projections. American armored divisions were advancing at rates that stressed supply lines and outpaced German ability to establish coherent defensive positions. The hedgerow cutting devices had removed the single greatest obstacle to mobile warfare in Normandy, and the strategic consequences were cascading through the entire European theatre. The tactical data validated everything Culin had believed when he'd first heated a propeller blade with a blowtorch and bent German beach obstacles into cutting prongs. For Operation Cobra, 3 of every 5 tanks in First Army were outfitted with the hedgerow cutting teeth. Those Rhino tanks had punched through German defensive lines that were supposed to hold for weeks, enabling a breakout that military historians would later identify as one of the decisive moments of the European campaign. But Culin's war wasn't over. His squadron received orders to advance into the exploitation phase, pursuing retreating German forces and identifying routes for follow-on divisions. The 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron spent August ranging ahead of American armor, mapping terrain, reporting enemy positions, and engaging German rearguards in the kind of fast-moving combat that reconnaissance units were designed to conduct. The bocage was finally behind them, replaced by more open terrain where American mobility advantages could fully manifest. The recognition came in forms both official and informal. For his invention, Culin received the Legion of Merit, an award typically reserved for field-grade officers rather than enlisted personnel. The citation accompanying the medal was unusually detailed for a combat decoration, specifically crediting Culin with developing a field expedient that had significantly enhanced American tactical mobility in hedgerow terrain. Bradley mentioned Culin by name in tactical bulletins distributed to First Army units, unusual recognition for a sergeant whose innovation had emerged from a motor pool rather than an engineering laboratory. The informal recognition was perhaps more meaningful. Tank crews who'd used the hedgerow cutters knew exactly what the devices had accomplished. They'd crossed hedgerows without exposing their belly armor to German anti-tank guns. They'd survived engagements that would have killed them 3 weeks earlier. They'd advanced through terrain that had previously been a death trap. When Culin visited forward units during August, tank commanders approached him to shake his hand, thank him for an invention that had saved their lives, and ask if he had any other brilliant ideas that might help them survive the war. Military historian Max Hastings notes that Culin was inspired by a Tennessee soldier named Roberts, who, during a discussion about how the bocage could be overcome, said, "Why don't we get some saw-teeth and put them on the front of the tank and cut through these hedges?" Rather than joining in the laughter that greeted this remark, Culin realized the idea's potential and put together a prototype. Culin, described as an honest man, attempted to give credit to Roberts, but this was forgotten in the publicity surrounding the invention. The story illustrated something fundamental about military innovation during wartime. The best ideas often emerged from soldiers who were closest to the problems, men who understood combat reality more intimately than engineers working in distant factories or staff officers planning operations from rear headquarters. The war took its toll on Culin in ways that no medal could compensate. Several months after his hedgerow cutter invention, Curtis Culin lost a leg to a landmine in the Hürtgen forest. The Hürtgen was Germany's version of the bocage, dense forest terrain where American forces fought a brutal attritional campaign that consumed divisions and produced casualty rates rivaling the worst fighting in Normandy. Cullin's reconnaissance squadron was operating ahead of advancing infantry when his vehicle triggered a German mine. The explosion killed his driver and shattered Cullin's left leg below the knee. Medics evacuated him under fire, and field surgeons amputated the damaged limb to save his life. The injury ended Cullin's combat service, but not his contribution to the war effort. During his recovery in England and later in the United States, he consulted with ordnance officers who were studying field modifications and adaptive engineering. The hedgerow cutter had demonstrated that combat soldiers could identify tactical problems and develop effective solutions faster than formal procurement systems. The army wanted to understand how to institutionalize that innovation, rather than relying on individual sergeants having brilliant ideas under fire. Cullin's response was characteristically pragmatic. The hedgerow cutter had worked because it solved a specific problem that was killing American soldiers. The innovation hadn't required advanced engineering or exotic materials. It had required someone paying attention to how tanks were dying, understanding why they were dying, and figuring out a simple modification that would stop them from dying. That approach could be replicated across hundreds of tactical problems if the army created systems that encouraged rather than punished field innovation. The broader impact of Culin's invention extended beyond Normandy and beyond Rhino tanks specifically. British forces adopted the device, which they called prongs, with 600 Mark I prongs delivered by August to be fitted to Sherman tanks, and a further 1,000 Mark II prongs produced for Shermans and tank destroyers. The concept spread to other Allied forces encountering similar terrain problems. Canadian units fabricated their own versions using salvaged German steel. French resistance fighters provided intelligence about bocage terrain in other regions, allowing Allied planners to identify areas where hedgerow cutters would be tactically valuable. The post-war assessment of the hedgerow cutter's impact varied among military historians, reflecting different interpretations of what had actually won Operation Cobra. Military historian Stephen Zalaga claims that the devices were not as widely used as legend would suggest, nor were they as effective as often believed. However, Max Hastings and Chester Wilmot credit the invention with restoring battlefield maneuverability to Allied forces. Martin Blumenson states that while the device restored mobility in hedgerow country, it was of little tactical value in the breakout, except possibly as a morale factor to troops, since tanks advanced on roads rather than cross-country. The debate over effectiveness missed something fundamental that every tanker who'd used a Rhino device understood viscerally. The hedgerow cutter's value wasn't purely tactical, it was psychological. For 6 weeks, American tank crews had approached every hedgerow knowing they would expose their most vulnerable armor to German anti-tank guns. They'd watched friends die in Shermans that bellied up over earthen walls and took pack 40 rounds through hull bottoms. They'd developed a profound fear of terrain that should have been navigable but had become a death trap. The Rhino device eliminated that fear. Crews approached hedgerows with confidence rather than dread. They crossed field boundaries aggressively rather than hesitantly. That psychological shift translated into tactical aggressiveness that German defenders couldn't match. President Dwight Eisenhower discussed Sergeant Culin's invention during a 1964 television interview with CBS correspondent Walter Cronkite on the 20th anniversary of D-Day, filming in the actual hedgerow country of France. Eisenhower's willingness to discuss a sergeant's field modification 2 decades after the war demonstrated the hedgerow cutter's lasting significance in American military thinking. The device had become a symbol of American adaptability, innovation, and the capacity of individual soldiers to solve problems that formal systems had failed to address. Curtis Culin married Bernice Enright in 1945 and lived in New York City, where he worked for Schenley Industries. He resumed civilian life as a salesman, a profession that required many of the same skills that had served him well in the army. Understanding customer needs, identifying practical solutions, and closing deals were fundamentally similar to understanding tactical problems, developing field expedients, and convincing superiors to implement innovations. Culin succeeded in business as he had succeeded in combat by paying attention to what actually worked rather than what theory suggested should work. Culin died in Greenwich Village, Manhattan, in 1963, 2 decades after the hedgerow battles that had made his name famous within military circles. His obituaries in New York newspapers mentioned his wartime service and his Legion of Merit, but most focused on his business career and his family. The hedgerow cutter had been a moment in his life rather than its defining characteristic. He had been a soldier who saw a problem, developed a solution, and moved on to other challenges once the war ended. The physical legacy of Culin's invention disappeared quickly after the war. Rhino tanks were demobilized and scrapped along with thousands of other Sherman variants that had served their purpose and were no longer needed. The hedgerow cutters themselves, welded steel prongs fabricated from German beach obstacles, were removed and discarded as units prepared vehicles for shipment home or long-term storage. By 1946, virtually no Rhino-equipped tanks remained in service anywhere in the world. The devices had been designed to solve a specific tactical problem in specific terrain, and once that problem was solved and that terrain left behind, they became obsolete. But the conceptual legacy endured. Military engineering schools taught the hedgerow cutter story as a case study in field innovation and adaptive problem-solving. The narrative became part of Army doctrine about encouraging rather than punishing unauthorized modifications when those modifications addressed genuine tactical needs. Ordnance officers studied the Rhino device's development timeline, from initial concept to mass production, as an example of how rapidly effective solutions could be implemented when bureaucratic obstacles were removed or bypassed. The Korean War demonstrated that Culin's approach to innovation remained relevant in new conflicts with different terrain challenges. American forces in Korea encountered problems with tanks operating on mountainous roads, navigating rice paddies, and engaging enemy positions in terrain that differed fundamentally from European battlefields. Solutions emerged from field modifications developed by soldiers and junior officers who understood their tactical environment better than distant planners. Bulldozer blades welded to tank hulls, improvised armor added to vulnerable sections, field-expedient gun mounts that enhanced firepower. The innovations varied, but the process echoed what Culin had demonstrated in Normandy. Identify the problem-killing soldiers. Develop a simple solution using available materials. Test it under combat conditions, and implement it before bureaucracy could intervene. Vietnam brought new terrain challenges and new field expedients. Armored cavalry units operating in jungle terrain developed modifications that enhanced mobility through dense vegetation and improved protection against mines and ambushes. Some innovations were sophisticated, involving specialized equipment and extensive engineering support. Others were crude welding projects performed in base camp motor pools, using scrap materials and borrowed equipment. The effective modifications, regardless of sophistication, shared common characteristics with Culin's hedgerow cutter. They solved real problems, they could be fabricated quickly using available resources, and they improved soldier survivability or mission effectiveness. The institutional military gradually learned to formalize what Culin had demonstrated informally. By the 1970s, the Army had established procedures for field testing and rapidly implementing soldier-developed modifications that addressed tactical needs. The bureaucratic approval process remained cumbersome, but pathways existed for good ideas to reach implementation faster than traditional procurement cycles allowed. Combat units deployed with authorized field modification kits that provided materials and instructions for common adaptive solutions. Ordnance units maintained stocks of materials suitable for welding projects and equipment modifications. The system wasn't perfect, but it represented institutional recognition that innovation often emerged from soldiers facing problems rather than engineers anticipating them. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan produced another generation of field modifications that traced conceptual lineage back to Culin's hedgerow cutters. Improvised armor added to vehicles, protecting against roadside bombs. Modified truck beds creating better protection for mounted infantry. Field expedient solutions to equipment shortcomings that were killing American soldiers faster than formal procurement systems could respond. Some modifications were officially sanctioned. Others emerged from motor pools and maintenance tents where sergeants made unauthorized changes they believed would keep their soldiers alive. The legal and bureaucratic status varied, but the motivation remained constant. Fix the problem now, before more people die waiting for official solutions. The technological sophistication of modern warfare hadn't eliminated the need for simple, practical field innovations. A 21st century sergeant welding additional armor to a Humvee in Iraq was doing essentially the same thing Curtis Culin had done, welding German beach obstacles to a Sherman tank in Normandy. Both were adapting equipment to meet tactical requirements that formal systems had failed to address. Both were accepting career risk by modifying government property without authorization. Both were making decisions that could save lives or end them, depending on whether their innovations worked or failed catastrophically. The memorial to Curtis Culin stands outside the municipal building in Cranford, New Jersey, a modest plaque mounted on a boulder describing his invention and its impact on the Normandy campaign. The memorial's text is factual rather than heroic, noting that Culin developed the hedgerow cutter, that it was used during Operation Cobra, and that he received the Legion of Merit for his innovation. What the plaque doesn't capture is the human dimension of what Culin accomplished. He watched American tankers die because their Shermans exposed belly armor when crossing hedgerows. He refused to accept that tactical reality as immutable. He figured out a crude but effective solution using materials that were literally lying on French beaches waiting to be salvaged. He risked court-martial by implementing unauthorized modifications to combat vehicles. He convinced skeptical officers that a sergeant with a welding torch had solved a problem that had stumped Army engineers. And in doing so, he changed the trajectory of the Normandy campaign and saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to German anti-tank guns firing at exposed Sherman underbellies. The story resonates because it's fundamentally American in character. An ordinary soldier, not particularly young or specially trained, confronted with a problem that was killing his friends, refusing to accept bureaucratic excuses for why the problem couldn't be solved, and developing a practical solution using available resources and common sense. Culin wasn't an engineer, wasn't an officer, wasn't someone the formal system would have identified as likely to revolutionize tank tactics. He was a 29-year-old sergeant who'd survived the Depression and understood that survival often required improvisation rather than waiting for official solutions. The hedgerow cutter also resonates because it demonstrates how small innovations can have strategic consequences. Culin didn't develop a new tank or a revolutionary weapon system. He welded scrap steel to existing equipment, solving a tactical problem that was constraining American mobility in specific terrain. Yet that small tactical innovation enabled Operation Cobra's success, which led to the Normandy breakout, which accelerated the liberation of France, which shortened the European war. The causal chain from welded steel prongs to strategic victory wasn't direct or simple, but it was real. Sometimes wars are won not by technological breakthroughs or brilliant strategy, but by sergeants who pay attention to how soldiers are dying and figure out simple ways to stop them from dying. The final irony of Curtis Culin's story is how quickly his innovation became obsolete. The hedgerow cutters were desperately needed for approximately 6 weeks of combat in specific French terrain. Once American forces broke out of Normandy into more open country, the devices became unnecessary. They added weight to tanks, complicated maintenance, and served no tactical purpose on roads or in open fields. Units removed them as quickly as ordnance personnel could cut off the welded prongs and restore Shermans to standard configuration. An invention that had been frantically manufactured by the hundreds in late July was being scrapped and discarded by September. But obsolescence doesn't diminish significance. The hedgerow cutter solved the problem it was designed to solve during the time period when that problem was preventing American victory in Normandy. That it became unnecessary once the tactical situation changed simply demonstrated that Culin had developed a solution precisely matched to a specific challenge, rather than a universal answer to all armoured warfare problems. Good engineering often means solving the immediate problem effectively, rather than creating elegant solutions that address hypothetical future challenges. General Omar Bradley understood this when he watched Culin's prototype crash through a Norman hedgerow on July 14, 1944. He didn't order a study of the innovation's long-term implications, or require additional testing to validate its effectiveness in diverse terrain conditions. He ordered 500 devices manufactured immediately because American tankers were dying today, not in some hypothetical future scenario where more comprehensive solutions might be available. Bradley's decision to implement an unauthorized field modification developed by an enlisted man violated standard procurement procedures, bypassed engineering approval chains, and created potential liability if the devices had failed catastrophically in combat. But it was the right decision because it solved a problem that was killing American soldiers and preventing the Normandy breakout. That willingness to accept unconventional solutions from unexpected sources represents perhaps the most important lesson of Curtis Culin's story. Military organizations are inherently conservative institutions, built on standardization, procedure, and hierarchical authority. Those characteristics provide necessary structure and discipline, but they can also stifle innovation and prevent rapid adaptation to changing tactical circumstances. The best military leaders understand when to enforce standards and when to embrace field expedients, when to demand proper procedures, and when to authorize sergeants to start welding steel to tanks in the middle of the night. Culin's hedgerow cutter succeeded not just because it was a good idea, but because leaders like Bradley were willing to implement it despite bureaucratic obstacles. The innovation required both bottom-up creativity and top-down support. Culin provided the creativity, identifying a problem and developing a practical solution. Bradley provided the support, recognizing the solution's value and using his authority to ensure it reached the soldiers who needed it. Neither element alone would have been sufficient. Culin's innovation would have remained a single prototype if Bradley hadn't ordered mass production. Bradley's desire to solve the hedgerow problem would have remained unfulfilled if Culin hadn't provided a workable solution. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.